It's interesting you're talking about that because I've been listening to this podcast called The Fall of Civilizations podcast. And there's a story about Rome approaching Carthage and threatening them with war. And Rome was like, okay, if you just give us all of your weapons, that'll de-escalate the thing. And they do. Considering this is called The Fall of Civilizations podcast, how do you think that turned out for Carthage?
No, I mean, I think you're spot on. I think as you look very realistically at what China's aims are, not just in the Western Pacific, but around the world, or Iran's or Russia's or North Korea's, you see that they actually respect strength, capability, will, and resolve. And those elements will check their behavior. And if they see an absence of those elements, then it only entices them to do more and more malign activity on the world stage.
So you're not concerned about angering China?
Well, I think that we should consider angering China, but I am here ultimately, or certainly was when I served in the United States Air Force, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. But I also realize that China every single day is considering whether they're going to make a move in the Western Pacific that would be massively counter to our interests. And they're considering our deterrent posture. And the less capability we have, the more likely it is that they'll make a move. And the less will we show, the more likely it is that they'll make a move. It's not as if we're going to do something so provocative that it forces them to make a move in the Western Pacific. Just the opposite. The less will we demonstrate, the more likely it is that they'll do something that is massively counter to our interests. And we've seen that as we've tried to placate them during the last 3 years, or maybe since Unrestricted Warfare was published in 1999. And again, they respect strength, capability, will, and resolve, and they will take advantage of the lack.
So what do you think the U.S. response should be? And so I'll give an example with the South China Sea. China uses short of war tactics, or salami slicing as it gets called. They build these artificial islands in the South China Sea to claim territory. The U.S. says, don't do that. They do that. And then the U.S. says, okay, just don't militarize them. China says they won't, and they do. What should the U.S. response be? Because obviously, with these short of war tactics, it's not like a missile strike on Beijing is the response to them building artificial islands.
So let me start talking about what our strategy is, or maybe should be, which is the necessary components of deterrence. And deterrence, as your listeners undoubtedly know, was a Cold War term that was very successful in stopping us from seeing a hot war against the Soviet Union. And now our official strategy in the United States is something that uses deterrence called integrated deterrence. And the only real difference from Cold War deterrence is that integrated means that we're looking across the American instruments of power, diplomatic, intelligence or informational, military, and economic, and maybe whole of society deterrence, in order to stop China from doing those things that we do not want them to do. And ultimately, the way deterrence works is that you demonstrate capability and will, and it changes the perceptions of the balance of cost, risk, and reward for that country that you're trying to deter. And so our official strategy, at least according to the National Defense Strategy, is this thing called integrated deterrence. The problem is that when the National Security Strategy was published after the National Defense Strategy, it didn't really mention integrated deterrence at all, other than in the military instrument of power component of the National Security Strategy. And you can't be integrated in your ability to deter if you're not using elements of power apart from the military instrument of power. And my ultimate concern in the Biden administration is that, one, while we've got the capability, we're not demonstrating the will in using that capability. And we're only saying integrated deterrence when the reality is that the military is thinking about deterrence posture in an integrated way. The other instruments of power aren't being integrated or used in a way that will check China's ambitions in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific and beyond. So the first step is demonstrating will and capability, not just in the South China Sea, but all around the world, and actually implementing an integrated deterrent posture that's far more than just the military or the defense component of deterrence.
Can you give an example of what that might look like if it was integrated across different things, not just the military?
So part of it goes to our military posture, but also our whole of government posture as we allocate resources in diplomacy and intelligence and military and the economy, so that we are focusing on this shift to the Pacific instead of what we have done for the last 25 years or so, which is a focus on other areas of the world. And so to me, really integrating with the economic instrument of power as an example to make sure that as we consider the balance of our capability in the economic sphere such that it integrates not just with a focus on the Western Pacific, but it also integrates with our allies and partners in the Western Pacific. We've got these amazing treaty allies in South Korea, in Japan, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Australia. And instead of just doing some military exercises and work in our posture with them, how are we actively integrating our diplomatic capability so that we are on one page with those allies and partners in the Western Pacific and, by the way, around the world as well, or economically or informationally as well? And I just fear that while we do some shifting of military capabilities to focus on the Western Pacific, if we're not actually working with those same treaty allies in a robust way in diplomacy and information and the economy, then we're leaving a lot on the table that lessens our ability to deter China from doing the things we do not want them to do.
Okay, so for a specific example, as Chris mentioned, China said, Xi Jinping promised in 2015 that China would not militarize the islands in the South China Sea. It was clear within 2 to 3 years that those islands were being militarized. It was a slow process. It was not announced anywhere, right? So what's a specific thing that's short of war on America's end that the U.S. could have done, whether it's military or diplomatic, to actually be like a what do you call it, like a measured response to that aggressive building of military hardware?
Yeah, I think in that case, that shadowing or mirroring that type of action by China would get their attention. Let's militarize an unknown area within that realm, within the Western Pacific or maybe even the South China Sea, and do the same things alongside of our allies and partners that are the things that have caused us such concern that the Chinese have done since 2015 or even before then. And so I think that's a great example where now we leverage the economies and the diplomacy and the information and the military realms to actually do some of the same types of things which would check them in their considerations about what they would do. And it would also further exacerbate some of the strategic challenges that they would have to consider as they consider whether they're going to make a move against Taiwan.